I grew up in the late Soviet Union, infused from the very early days, maybe too much so. And, it's sort of like Russian grandmothers traumatizing me with stories from the gulags and stuff like that. But it was very much from an early age ingrained in me that we were living in a society that was extremely restrictive about what you're supposed to think. And in living memory, members of my own family had experienced some of the terrible consequences of what happened when they said the wrong thing or expressed an opinion or made a political comment or made a joke in the wrong place at the wrong time, etc. So from a very early age, I had this experience of understanding that freedom of expression is something that's always under attack.
Right.
And then when I came over to the UK, it was like, oh, wow, this is a much freer place where people are free. But I also saw that even here in the West, there were always people who wanted to take our ability to joke and play and say things away as well. And I remember my comedy heroes growing up were people like George Carlin and Bill Hicks and all these guys who were pushing back against what was then the Christian right in America, and less so, but to some extent here, the sort of religious right, who wanted to restrict what people could say, what they could joke about. There was a sort of morality police almost, intellectually. And it shows up in all sorts of ways. I mean, Bill Hicks's last comedy performance on Letterman, it was censored. And it wasn't censored because of woke snowflakes or whatever.
Yeah.
It was censored by people who didn't like the fact that he was joking about gay marriage and things like that, right? So I grew up observing that, and then I sort of really didn't pay much attention to what was happening in the political and cultural space. I was busy trying to, survive, basically. And then when I became a comedian, and that was only about 7 or 8 years ago, it was a bit of a career change for me, I suddenly realized that my idea of what Western society was, what comedy was, from watching people like Carlin and Hicks and others, really didn't map on very well onto what was happening here, because we were increasingly living in an environment where people were, again, very keen to restrict what you are allowed to say and what you're allowed to joke about and what opinions you're allowed to have. There's a kind of, I call it a totalitarianism of the mind. This was the communist approach.
Yeah.
And increasingly you see it here, where it's like you're supposed to have a set of opinions. And if you don't, you're supposed to be destroyed for it in many cases, particularly if you're a public person, because there's this idea that your opinion really, really, really matters because you have 20,000 Twitter followers or whatever. And so who am I on a personal level is someone who is really maybe hypersensitive, but I think some people like that are necessary in society, to the fact that there will always be people who want to restrict what you're allowed to think and say. And I oppose that vehemently, and I always will. So that's who I am.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there. I want to dig into a few things that you mentioned. One is about, the person with the public profile. Obviously, they're under a lot of scrutiny, and they're engaged. They may be expected to engage with some of these issues on a daily basis, especially if they're out in the Twitter sphere or wherever. But I wanna hone in on people with less public profiles. Just an everyday guy, gets up early in the morning, goes to work, punches in, puts in, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 hard hours of work, goes home to his family, if he has a family, and he's just focused on surviving. Maybe he's an immigrant, maybe he's not, What do we say to the guy who is perhaps bothered by some of the things he sees going on? He's bothered by the censoriousness. He's bothered by the thought crime stuff. And he's thinking, this doesn't make much sense. I'm supposed to think red and say blue. Like I'm supposed to, see that the king is naked and not comment on this. But he's just focused on surviving. He doesn't need, say he works even middle management, small company or an office, he doesn't want issues with HR. He wants to collect his paycheck, feed his wife and his child. She's also perhaps working, and he's like, you know what? This is not my fight. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not a public intellectual. I want to put my head down. I gotta just survive. What do we say to this person? I mean, the argument can be made, of course, that if everyone just put their head down, it leads to disastrous consequences. But there are a lot of people who are really maybe not thinking of, maybe they're not on Twitter. A lot of them aren't, they're not on social media thinking about this stuff every day. What do we say to the guy who's just, going to work, trying to survive?
So I think that if you are truly unconcerned about what's happening, then carry on with your life.
Right.
And do whatever you want to do. If you are concerned about what's happening, then you have a duty to do something. What that is depends on everybody's situation. I can't sit here and say, single mother of two, you need to sort of get fired in your job for saying the whatever.
I'm sorry, where does that duty come from?
Where does that duty come from? Well, if you feel that something that is happening in your society is wrong, fundamentally morally wrong, right? People are being persecuted for having opinions.
Right.
People are being prevented from speaking their mind. It's not just wrong on a moral level, although it is. It's also fundamentally antithetical to the very idea of the Western project, right? Western civilization is built on certain principles, and the idea of freedom of expression is one of them. So the duty you have is, if you value what we have in the West, you have to contribute to upholding that society. Otherwise, other people who feel they have a duty to protect you from other people's opinions and protect you from your own opinions and protect you from being exposed to the wrong information, they will achieve their aim, which is creating a society in which you can't say what you think. So that's where the duty comes from. From a moral point of view, you're observing something being done that is wrong. And we've seen over and over and over in history what happens when the vast majority of people know something's wrong and stay silent about it. And I come from one of those societies. But when I say a duty to do something, I don't mean that your duty is to sacrifice yourself on the altar of free speech and whatever. You could just simply support people who do it for you, right? You could, and I know this sounds like a self-serving point. However, we have a lot of people.
A valid one, though.
A valid, I hope it is, who watch our show, who support Triggernometry, and they say, I can't say what I think at work, but you guys are doing it on my behalf. Here is £5 a month. And that's something that is open to you. But more broadly, I feel that, from my perspective, yes, not everyone is going to have a podcast. But when we started Triggernometry, it wasn't from a place of, hey, we're going to make loads of money and be super successful. That's why we're doing it. We were fed up with what was happening. And the desire to do what we do didn't start from a place of comfort. It was like, we think what's happening in the world is wrong. What's happening in our own industry is wrong. And we're going to do something about it. And actually, most people think that, the name of our show is a like FU to the woke snowflakes, terms that we never use. It's not at all. It was actually us saying to the comedy industry, which is where Francis and I came from, like, we're going to talk about some controversial issues. You might be offended. We were aware that we were likely to be punished for doing what we did. And we were. But sometimes you have to take the punishment because you believe in doing something that's important. And long term, you may well be rewarded for it.